Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Future in Review podcast. My name is Berit Anderson. I am our podcast host and the COO of Future in Review and Strategic News Service. I'm here today with Evan Anderson, who is the CEO of InventIP and the founding author and publisher of The Viral Economy, which he wrote throughout most of the pandemic and was my go-to source for what to do if you're trying to figure out what the heck is going to happen with COVID. And we're going to talk today a little bit more about where we stand in today's COVID pandemic and what to expect from monkeypox and how to think about preparing for a future in which both of these things may continue to be, and in some cases, maybe even become increasingly more so present and able to transmit easily between people, regardless of whether or not they're having sex, as opposed to some of the information that we're seeing out there about monkeypox. So Ev, I'm wondering if you could just start off by giving us a sense of we are at a place now, I think people generally have relaxed around COVID. You and I both came back from a couple of conferences recently. Most people out there are not wearing masks anymore. And I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit more about, currently we like in the last year, since the start of the calendar year, we have seen half of all transmission during the entire pandemic. However, deaths have declined, but we're still on track to lose probably, I think, between 100 and 250,000 American lives every year in the next couple of years. That's what estimates are saying now. And I'm just curious, like, how do you think about that?
Well, that's a very broad question, but I would say I think about it in slightly searing terms at times. I think we're in a place right now where some good things have happened and some bad things have happened, right? So the good things that people love to talk about when they're trying to paint a rosier picture than perhaps we should have, but are still true and good, are that, as of where we stand today, the death rates are far down for vaccinated populations, although that's starting to change, which we should talk about. And that means, and severe cases as well. And so that means that, despite new variants at the moment, and particularly with a booster, it does appear that your risk of dying, particularly if you're in that kind of middle category where you're at risk and would have been very at risk before the vaccines came out, your risk of dying is still much lower than it would have been before. But that does not mean that will hold, right? So the center cannot hold is kind of something that I quoted in The Viral Economy and kind of pops into my head on a regular basis, where we're looking at a virus that mutates so fast. I mean, if you would think back to the early days of the pandemic, we didn't know that. And for kind of a while, it seemed right in the beginning of 2020 as though that wasn't going to be the case. And if that had been true, if it had been true that the virus did not mutate a lot, we would have been in a great position now because our vaccines would have been effectively the same efficacy as they were early on. So if you recall, when we all first got access to vaccines, it felt great because suddenly
we thought we were done. We're good.
Yeah, the more you vaccinate, the better, right? And it's a vaccination campaign like many others we've had, and that looks pretty encouraging because your numbers just start to rise with vaccinations. But then we hit boosters, and there was a reason we hit boosters, and we hit waning immunity, and we're seeing waning immunity as well for previous infections. So the kind of idea that was temporarily floating in the air there, that we were kind of it was like a 0 or 1 question, and you either did or did not do the thing, and then you either were or were not protected, is not the case. I think a lot of people feel betrayed by that, but they shouldn't, because it's a moving new thing. It's not a traditional pathogen by pretty much any standard. It's a new kind of pathogen. We're not used to the way it works. It doesn't work like even other coronaviruses do. It mutates much faster. So we should have probably known all along, and some of us pretty much did know all along that was going to be a problem.
If you had been reading The Viral Economy early on, you would have seen this coming. I'm curious. So you mentioned something about the fact that death rates have been going down, and that's starting to change. What's going on there?
Well, so we don't know yet. And what's going on is a new variant, right? That's the obvious part. We don't know yet what the change will be, but we do know that there's more immune escape in the newest variants. particularly BA5, right? Eric Topol, by the way, if you are out there and looking for good information, has done some really good posting on social media, writing of articles, et cetera, that is always pretty accurate descriptions of what's going on with the newest variants. So follow that. But anyhow, we have a new variant that's, starting to increase hospitalizations, increase deaths. Right now, it doesn't look necessarily, I mean, the UK is already starting to come down off that curve of that variant a little bit. I hope it looks like it. And right now, it doesn't seem like it's necessarily going to kind of blow our whole immunity out of the water, but it's one of many variants, and there will be many, many more. And so the longer that we pretend that there is not an ongoing pandemic, the longer the virus is going to be circulating in the population and passaging through human beings, which means it can train itself to do a million different things just through replication. So the probability that you're going to get a variant that is either more deadly or more severe, doesn't kill you, but puts you in the hospital or damages your organs more than traditional COVID strains have, is only going to get higher the more you allow it to be spread.
So I want to address, you said something I think is important, and I've heard a lot of people in my network or people that I've met, talking about COVID, say, well, at least it's, a lot less,
milder.
It's a lot milder.
Yeah.
And at least I'm not going to die, I think is what I'm hearing other people say. What should you worry about? What are I know clearly we're just starting to get a sense of what this means, what long COVID entails, because we're only 2 years into the pandemic, but what kinds of, why not get it? Why is it worth, why is it worth wearing a mask? If you truly want to make sure you do not get COVID, is that possible? And if so, how do you balance having, what are best practices for your daily life that give you some freedom and ability to go out there and not go crazy as a human being? But
so I'm going to jump in here because we're on question number 3 now. So first, mild, it's not necessarily milder. It has been milder in populations that have already been infected and have been vaccinated. That comes down to a question of, is it actually milder, or is it kind of the same as it was before, but we have some built up immunity, in which case the next question is, if that immunity wanes and you become less immune over time, is it going to become more of a problem just by nature if we're not doing boosters, et cetera, right? So that's one important thing, is that I don't think that it's entirely honest when people just claim that the strain is milder, like Omicron. They said the strain was milder without describing why. Right. And that requires some degree of research.
So Omicron was milder among vaccinated populations.
Well, Omicron was milder among vaccinated and previously infected populations because at the point that it burst onto the scene, we'd had so many infections globally that it's a little bit hard to track. And I've seen some great, back and forth between, I think, very honest science brokers, essentially, about whether that is because we had some built up immunity. And it kind of would be like a semblance of that herd immunity we were looking for, which it turns out is not necessarily something we can rely on. It's the same question, right? So did we have some existing immunity in the population? Sure. Did the vaccines add some immunity too? Sure, of course. And then the question is, how long does that last? And was Omicron itself milder in its genetic coding and its effect on the body? Or, were our existing bits of immunity floating around in people that had either been infected or been vaccinated helping as well?
Yeah.
And will that, last forever? We don't actually know that. So that's one big question. I think the second question you asked was, help remind me.
Long-term effects. Why did I not get COVID?
Yeah. So at this point, from everything that we've seen, it's extremely common, which is not great. I have not seen evidence that it doesn't, just like a flip of the coin, occur at a certain percentage rate each time you get an infection. So I don't think that's a settled debate either. So, the estimates range a lot, but I would say kind of somewhere in the middle line would be 20% of infections result in long-term symptoms, which symptoms sort of depends, right? So some can be kind of mild, like you lose your sense of smell, which the implications of that aren't great because it means that, certain cells in your body are still being damaged or attacked. But those things, maybe not such a big deal, but organ damage, brain damage, the things that are causing the brain fog, if it's brain damage and that's lasting, that is not good, right? So that's a really high percentage rate, even if it's kind of a middle of the road estimate, to be condemning the entire population to just suffer through. And then the secondary question would be, if that same chance of getting long COVID occurs each time you get infected, and every person is getting 4 infections a year, then that's going to be really, really bad. Not
so
just
essentially one in 5 of those you could get long COVID.
Yeah, that would, it just like with probability with flipping a coin, if the chance would be the same on each instance. And if that is the case, and you don't get some sort of protection from a previous infection, which these days does not look like the scene is that rosy for that kind of concept, then your chances may be kind of similar for getting long COVID, or even worse or better depending on a variant, right? We don't know, but that's not good. You don't want to be exposing the population repeatedly to something that has each time a 20% chance of resulting in long-term debilitating.
The thing that scares me the most, that convinces me to wear my mask inside, is when all of these reports about kind of like opening people up who have, or looking inside people who have long COVID, and I just finding tons of blood clots like all throughout their body, right? And so that could happen to anyone who had COVID, and they might not know about it.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I think people get confused about, because people who stand to benefit from minimizing the disease will tend to talk about it like it's the cold or the flu now, because people aren't in the ICU as often as they used to be. But one, that's not guaranteed, which we've already talked about, and two, the actual things that are happening inside your body during a COVID infection are often extremely unfavorable, and particularly if they last, right? And so we're figuring out now that they may last. But I don't imagine myself getting brain damage when I get the flu. I don't imagine myself getting long-term heart damage, liver, kidney damage, and I certainly don't imagine myself filling with microclots and having my blood turn muddy. So those are things that are new. They're very SARS-CoV-2 specific, and I think it's really disingenuous that people don't discuss those when they're talking about building herd immunity or et cetera, having multiple infections.
Yeah. So a good reason. So part of this. Okay, so let's switch gears for a minute and talk about monkeypox, because this is a new, relatively new entrant to the infectious disease scene. If this is a giant, it's not a new entrant, but it's a new entrant in that it is suddenly spreading, right? Yes. It's suddenly become a cause of concern. Monkeypox has been around for a long time.
Yeah.
Where are we now on that?
We are, I would say, right where you don't want to be. The WHO has just, finally announced by a veto by the head of the WHO, Tedros. It has been announced that it is now considered to be, an emergency situation. I can't remember the exact terminology that WHO uses. It's not necessarily pandemic, but emerging pathogen.
Emergency.
Yeah. None of that really, to be honest, matters except within the WHO's remit and the way that they get funding and can, then deploy resources. In that case, it matters. In terms of the spreading of the thing itself, when it first emerged, it was probably not a huge surprise to people that had worked on monkeypox before, because lots of people had been warning for ages that same kind of problem as we see now with letting COVID spread. You shouldn't let it spread over and over again. And it wasn't being particularly contained in certain parts of Africa, right? So there's been monkeypox outbreaks over and over again in West Africa, et cetera. And a lot of different, very great, smart public health people were, explaining that just like with any other spreading disease is a problem and can lead to something new. So now that it has, we early on got a study out of a group in Portugal, and they were essentially saying, while this looks like 2019 strains of monkeypox, it has about 50 mutations, which I don't recall the exact number, but was something like, an order of magnitude larger than the normal rate of mutation, 10x or something like that. And that's really bad, because that means we have to figure out what those mutations do. So if it's, much more similar to an earlier strain, you can expect it to behave more like that earlier strain. And clearly it's not. So it's more transmissible in one way or another. I'm sure a lot of people are going to come out with a lot of really good studies on why, but it'll take a little bit. And for the meantime, we have got a a spreading pathogen in the middle of another pandemic that, while not extremely deadly to most adults in its traditional form, is kind of a new version, right? And the same problem is going to keep reoccurring if you let these things spread. And just like with COVID, if we get 10 million new monkeypox infections, that may breed new variants, and so we kind of run right back into the same problem. And all of this is to say, there's a reason we try to contain pathogens, particularly ones that tend to be deadly, and monkeypox tends to be deadlier in children. So, if you're thinking it's not a problem, then maybe think twice, particularly once schools get back in session. If we don't understand how it spreads or how quickly it spreads or why, we're in trouble. And so far, the CDC has been not helpful in that process. They've been very focused on, I think, the kind of do not panic thing. And I'm not saying people should panic. Panicking helps no one in any situation, but keeping people misinformed so that they don't panic because you sort of presuppose they would is not a very genuine or useful public health measure. And it tends to just create chaos. So right now there's a lot of messaging that it's only occurring in men seeking men, essentially, men sleeping with men. This just has all the hallmarks of what happened during the original outbreak of HIV. It's the same story. And so it's very frustrating to watch at times, because that's provably not true with monkeypox, was not the narrative before on monkeypox or how it spread, was not the represented caseload of monkeypox in earlier strains in Africa. So there's no reason to believe that.
So for those who are not familiar with why it's so overrepresented in the gay community, can you please explain why that is problematic as a measure of who is?
Yes. So unsurprisingly, close contact makes it easy to spread a virus, right? And that's true for pretty much any pathogen I can think of that spreads from person to person. So the closer the contact, the easier it is to spread. I'm not even sure that there's a direct causation that's been studied with monkeypox and fluid exchange, for instance. Right. But you can get it from touching each other's skin, and you can get it from breathing close to each other. I think it's much less transmissible by air traditionally. I don't know about the new strain, but traditionally than things like SARS-CoV-2, but that's not saying much, because COVID is the most transmissible airborne virus we've ever seen. So that's not exciting news. That just means it's a little bit less terrifying that way, which is great. But it just literally, there is no scientific backing to the idea that it only affects the homosexual male population. There's lots of reasons to kind of surmise why it might spread quickly, particularly during like Pride Month or something. That's always going to be a factor with any amount of large scale human gathering and close contact. So
I think part of what I was getting at is, and it's important to understand this as you think about why this is a false narrative, which is, and this is something that you told me the other day, so I'm just going to repeat it. But when you're testing, when you identify, only those who are members of the gay population or who have had sex with men recently, gay men recently, have access to tests in the early part of the pandemic. It turns out that all of the data will tell you that this is primarily an issue among populations.
Yeah. And so we've had this problem where with limited testing available, it was very early on in the outbreak of monkeypox, it was very clear that it had happened at a couple different, primarily MSM events, right? Which men seeking men events. That's fine. It's easily believable. However, if you then restrict testing because of the risk category, right, you've essentially got like a small sample size of spread, and you're using it to build your entire response mechanism, which is not smart and not very forward-looking. And so particularly when we're already seeing cases, already in multiple countries, we've had cases that are not just primarily in that group. And we know that a lot of testing is being restricted just to at-risk people. And that is, all specifically the homosexual population, then that's going to be 100% of your cases, because they're the only ones you gave a test. And it means very little in terms of where it actually is spreading. And so I think what we have right now is a situation where that everything I just described has already occurred. I'm sure it will turn out to be a mistake. I think we're learning that now already. And what we really have is untraced spread in other populations. And so we will find out how much of that is occurring. But
How widespread do you think this is now?
fairly widespread. I mean, I can't remember who it was, but someone was just, you know, a epidemiologist was just recently quoted in the news is talking about how we're kind of at our last moment. It's probably Scott Gottlieb, but we're kind of at our last moment to contain this thing. I think that may have already passed because we had a pretty strong window there for a couple of months to do all the things that you would normally do, like ring-fenced vaccinations around new cases, but we didn't have the testing. And so just like the beginning of, you know, the COVID pandemic, if you can't test and trace, then you can't ring fence vaccinate everyone who's been exposed because you don't know who's been exposed. So that is already a major problem. We probably do have some window here, and I would really hope that some very robust response just suddenly comes into play. But I would probably give that a low probability at this point. And so I think the best thing to do is to be much more aware of, and we don't have to get into it in this brief piece, but, you know, do go and look up the symptoms. Do assume, by the way, that it is not what it has always looked like. So the one thing that I've heard from doctors and from other folks that have gotten it, that have, you know, discussed it publicly, is that it doesn't always look like, you know, a huge number of lesions all over your body. So one doctor described it to me as sometimes it just looks like a pimple. So without, you know, panicking or being too terrified or anything like that, if something feels off or you feel like, you know, this is a really weird, you know, new bump I have,
all of our YouTube subscribers are going to rush to the mirror and check out their zits now.
Yeah, I mean, you know, again, panic helps no one. It's not worth worrying too much or going fully hypochondriac about every, you know, little mark on your skin, but paying attention is worth it when there's a new and spreading virus, right? And particularly because this thing is, it may not be as infectious as, you know, the most infectious virus we've ever seen, but it is certainly long lasting. And so it's very easy to spread it, I think, probably for that reason alone, because it sticks around for weeks and weeks. And so you can be infectious for a prolonged period of time. And if you don't want to give it, you know, to people that you know and love, just like all of us should not want to give anything else to people that we know and love, then it's worth keeping an eye out and knowing that it doesn't just show up all of a sudden as some crazy, you know, wild infection. There are asymptomatic cases. There are very small symptom cases where there's very few symptoms. So it's worth paying attention to and knowing if it's spreading in your area. And it's worth remembering that it is not, you know, simply based on sexual contact or something like that. It's
yeah,
actually,
you should try not to snuggle with anyone, you know, too many outside sources if you can help it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, people are people. So I always think that public health policy that seeks to stop people from doing things that humans naturally do is silly. But one good recommendation I've seen is, you know, if you are in close contact with people and you develop symptoms, then you should call a doctor
for a while.
Yeah, and you should maybe stop touching people for a while if you feel like there's an off chance you might have just contracted monkeypox.
Okay, so we are just about out of time, but I want to close by saying one thing, which is you've mentioned twice during the course of this conversation that both COVID and monkeypox are mutating much more quickly. You have also mentioned, and I think, you know, this is something I think we've talked about many times before on this podcast. We've talked about it in the global report. There is a lot of reason to believe that COVID, especially, potentially monkeypox, although I believe it requires further investigation, could have been artificially created as weapons, right? As bioweapons. And I want to say this because you know, although we don't know for sure if that is true of monkeypox yet, the fact that it is naturally changing so quickly means that it is more likely.
Yeah, so I would say I'd probably phrase it almost in the reverse of what you've just said. It is extremely discouraging that we have two different pathogens moving around the world at the same time that appear to have a drastically higher rate of mutation than the things that we're used to dealing with. Mm-hmm. In the case of monkeypox, it's doubly discouraging because that has been a traditionally extremely lab studied pathogen. And there's a bunch of different reasons for that, but the reason that people were studying it in the lab is that it's not smallpox, but it is, you know, editable. And so there were indeed a lot of bioweapons programs that used strains of monkeypox because retained plausible deniability well. So all of that is not to say that these things are bioweapons. All of that is to say that we should be paying a lot of attention when we repeatedly encounter new strains of known pathogens or some kind of new version of a previously known pathogen that don't look anything like anything we've ever seen. And I think that that's kind of a weird place to be in. It's hard to know exactly what to say about that, except that it should be deeply studied. We should be trying to trace where these things came from. We should be trying to trace why they mutate. We should not trust these pathogens.
What?
I said we should not trust these pathogens.
Right. So I think my bigger point is, if it's feeling a little bit like we are in a biological warfare game of Squid Game, right? And the goal is stay alive. And if the next few years are, the point of this conversation is how to help people understand and prepare for what may be coming. We can expect to see a large number of mutations of coronavirus, of COVID, which may or may not be more deadly, but the more times they happen, the more likely it is that are deadlier strains coming out. We know that the more times we contract COVID, the more likely it is that we will have long-term health effects and long COVID symptoms that could be deadly eventually if they are not, even if the COVID itself does not kill you immediately. And I think that is really the point of this conversation, is I think people understanding that is a very different framing of COVID than is currently being promoted in the media. And we want to make sure that those of you who are following the work that Evan has been doing, tirelessly over the last 2 years, the work that, we have been doing to help people understand what to expect from COVID, know that that is how we see COVID going forward. And that is why you should try not to get it. And that is why you should still, if you care about not getting it and not dying eventually from tons of tiny blood clots, you should still be wearing a mask indoors. If you don't, we can't stop you, and we don't really have any interest in trying to stop you, but we will be doing it.
Yeah, I would say that, well, I have two thoughts, and the second one is silly, so maybe we'll end on that one. But the first one is, I think a lot of people really love black and white. And I know it's easier to think that way. And a lot of people have gotten themselves into this sort of place where they, are so tired of the pandemic, and rightfully so, right? I mean, why wouldn't you be? Everyone is very tired of the pandemic.
We all want to hang out with our friends again.
Yeah, and they just want to go back to their old life and see people and et cetera, and right down to not having to wear a mask at all. I understand that too. It's hot in the summertime, and you don't want to have something strapped to your face. It's not weird to dislike that feeling. But in terms of what you can do to slow the spread or to lower the chances that you contract something, it doesn't mean you have to do everything perfectly all the time.
Right.
So if you're feeling like you're tired and you want to, have a social gathering or whatever, that's very different than doing it every single night, right? And that's very different than, I always get to the same point with talking about masking with people with risk and reward. So, what is the value that you glean from popping into a gas station and not having your mask on compared to putting your mask on? It's almost nothing. Compared to
you want the gas station people to see your face. They want them to.
So I think, remembering risk and reward and going, do I really care if I have to wear this thing for 30 minutes while I'm grocery shopping versus, at my family dinner? Right. No matter what your choices are, there's a lot of ways to reduce risk without having to feel like you're living, some sort of caged life. And personally, I still try to be pretty much close to perfect. I spend time with my friends indoors sometimes when it's a small group of people and we don't wear masks, but I try to be pretty much perfect about putting my mask on anywhere else. And the risk reward benefit analysis for me for anything outside of a social gathering with like 2 people is pretty much 0 for not wearing a mask. Particularly given all the things that we've talked about today about what it can do to your body, COVID. I mean, yeah, there's just very little benefit to entering a random public establishment without as much protection as you can do. And then my last piece, which kind of applies more to monkeypox, which is one thing to look for with monkeypox is we're going to be learning a lot more about how it transmits, how likely each kind of transmission is, et cetera. Like I said, I think it's going to be very clearly the case that it's not just, some one group of others, we call it othering in anthropology or whatever, can be, put in the corner and they're the only ones who get monkeypox. I think that's very silly and extremely dishonest and dangerous thinking. But we'll learn a lot more about how you do get monkeypox. And I think just keeping an eye out for that so that you know how to respond. There's aspects of monkeypox that sound really scary, like, oh, it lasts a long time on surfaces. Just wait for people to study what that means in terms of actually getting it before getting too scared about it. Because you'll be overwhelmed if you just think that it's everywhere, and and there's no, just like panicking, there's no benefit to being overwhelmed. So we'll learn a lot more. We'll try to keep you updated at SNS and at FIRE, and hopefully there will be a lot of good news as well as some other news, but it will be very clearly spreading for some time to come. And the case counts are definitely going to go way up from where they are now, both in the US and globally. And so I just kind of, what popped into my head when we were talking about it was, I don't know how many people remember this old children's song, but it went something like, don't you put it in your mouth if you don't know where it's been, or if you don't know what it is. And so we kind of have the same.
I grew up with you. I've never heard of this.
You never heard that one? It was a classic. It was, to encourage kids not to eat, random dirty things off the floor.
Well, it turns out that eating dirt is actually good. Like if you're out in the woods, it's
different.
That's actually good for kids, but just not the.
It depends on where you are, right? But that's hence the if you don't know where it's been. So I think that that's kind of the same principle. People are very excited to sort of go back to life, going into giant stadiums full of 10,000 people. But you're going to want to have a mask on for all the same reasons, and it's good to be a little bit cognizant of what's entering your immune system or your body right now. All
right. Well, we have to wrap up, but thank you so much for this conversation. It's been really helpful. I think I'm hoping that it will help other people as they are trying to think about what to expect and how to think about taking calculated, smart risks that bring you personal joy instead of just showing the gas station clerk your really nice makeup for the day or whatever that might be.
Yeah, I think Marie Kondo is a great note to end on, actually. If it sparks joy, then it may be worth risk. If it does not, what are we doing?
All right, the Marie Kondo of masking. I like it. Thanks, Ev.
All right.